So this video was actually a pretty tough call to make, since there have been like 8 things that happened in the last 2 days which are newsworthy. It was a pretty close tie between the Supreme Court deciding in favor of free association for business owners against the LGBT, and how in response, LGBT figures have gone completely off the fucking hinges, saying things about straight people which, if directed at a race of people, would sound like the second to final solution. And yes, that's the actual picture they used for this article. At this point, this is basically self-parody. But I ultimately decided to go with this since I have more to say on the matter, and I think it's 1,000 times more important since it introduces an incredibly important discussion to mainstream discourse, and that is the question of political authority and its legitimacy. Something which, if it didn't happen to be able to be used as a beating stick against Donald Trump by the opposing side of politics, would probably not have happened. Which that's something I've noticed about both sides of the political spectrum. If debating with them you present something in just the right way, you can get them to unwittingly argue against one of their own ideas while thinking that they're arguing against their opponents. I think the best and easiest form of this trick to pull off is to question gun control advocates about political corruption from within the government, to which they'll go on and start talking about how evil they think the Republicans and the NRA are. Then you can tie them in a knot by pointing out that they're advocating for the same government which they just acknowledged to be corrupt to be the only entity which can own guns. But of course, what I'm talking about is Trump's recent tweet where he states that he could pardon himself if convicted of a crime, which wow, wait a minute, someone in the resistance crowd actually made an intelligent statement for once. Anyway, as someone who responded to Trump rightfully pointed out, this would mean that legally speaking, the president could commit any crime and then immediately absolve himself of criminal responsibility. Well, I mean, of course, it's limited intelligence because they go on to act as if this is something exclusive to Trump, when in reality, every president ever has had this exact same ability, which leads me on to my point. Well, yes, the president absolutely does have the ability to pardon himself of any wrongdoing according to the Constitution, and this is a direct consequence of the inherent nature of the government itself, which is frankly why I can't believe that this debate is actually even happening on mainstream media outlets, because this illustrates a perfect example of the inherent problem with political authority. The government, in its essence, is simply an organization which has established a monopoly on arbitration, or, as statists refer to it, the rule of law. So it should be self-evident that political authority does not and cannot possibly have a justification for itself, because it's not possible for someone to delegate rights to themselves, or anyone else for that matter, which is different from a normal person, because that is inherently hypocritical and operates off a double standard. Yet this is the only way that a government can operate, since a government doesn't produce commodities on its own, and therefore it inherently needs to steal from people who do produce commodities in order to operate. The only way a state is able to do this is through monopolizing a society's arbitration so that no one can contest this. Hence, what defines a state is the monopoly on arbitration that the organization has. And a natural consequence of being the only organization which can have rulings and disputes is being able to impose your will onto others, because where are they going to go? It's not like they can contest the findings, because this is the only organization which can have findings. And, of course, the organization in question can bail itself or any other person or group out whenever they commit a crime. Hence the situation we have right now with Donald Trump.
What about the police, Biff? They're gonna match up the bullet with that gun!
Again, I own the police!
So regardless of the Trump-Russia debate, that's not even slightly relevant, nor is that the story here. What's important is that this narrative creates two possible outcomes which are being broadcast to everyone. Either you support the Constitution and the idea of political authority, in which case you agree that politicians can commit crimes and get away with it, or you oppose the social contract and political authority because you believe in a justified society, in which case you're an anarchist. There's no in-between here, which is why I'm in such disbelief that the media said anything about this, because this isn't an anti-Trump narrative, this is an anti-state narrative. They're discrediting themselves by reporting on this. Now, as you may suspect, the fact that logic alone can disprove political authority by itself implies that ethics exist independently of any arbiter, meaning that there is no utility provided to a society by having a so-called rule of law. And in fact, humans have organized in mass for thousands of years before the first states emerged in 3500 BC, as evidenced by the fact that many maritime trade routes are around 100,000 years old, which is fascinating because at that time there would have also been multiple different subspecies of human existing at the same period, implying that other species of human were also able to recognize ethical frameworks. So surely if people organized in mass and traded, there would have definitely had to have been crime, and if there was crime, we can conclude that arbitration existed in order to have this stable society for so long. We don't even need to go back that far, as we've had examples of stateless societies within the last few centuries, such as ancient Norse Ireland, Cospaia, and neutral Morsnet, to name a few. Now, you might be asking how arbitration works without a state. Well, arbitration in a stateless society is relatively simple. If you have a dispute with someone over something, you can go to an arbiter willing to hear your case. Monetary payment would likely be the most common form of trade for these services. However, there's no doubt that mutual aid courts or charity-provided courts would also exist, since some would find these to be more desirable, and some arbiters would be willing to work under those conditions. They provide the best service that they can, because if they don't, it stains their reputation, and people don't want an arbiter that will take bribes or favoritism, which costs them customers and in turn harms their livelihood. This also, like everything in a stateless society, ensures that the price will be relatively low, since this is a relatively high-demand service, and competition encourages price dropping in order to encourage more people to trade with them. Now, as for crimes in a stateless society, you could trade for crime insurance, which would pay the client for the loss or damages, since crime insurance firms would have a direct incentive to lower the amount of crime that occurs. They would hire private security to patrol for their customers or the general area their customers occupy, and hire private investigators to find the criminal perpetrators. Then the criminal and victim choose a court that they agree to. If they both agree on the same court, then they could go to that court. If they disagree on which court, then they could choose their court based on the three-judge system, which is where both of the chosen courts choose their own court. Courts are of course incentivized to do this for the same reason they're incentivized to do this in disputes. Arbitration would be based on restorative justice rather than punitive damages, so a criminal, if found guilty, would pay the victim, the courts, and the insurance, and if they didn't, the courts, the insurance companies, and everyone involved would blacklist them, and no one in society would associate with them, effectively destroying their lives. That is, of course, until they actually paid. I think more so than anything, the reason that people cling to the state even after Trump or any other president says things like this is because they simply don't know about what justice would be like without a state, or don't think it's possible. Either way, those are my thoughts on the situation.